I am so delighted and I'm excited to join the Houston's Freedmanstown Conservancy and all of the many friends that are there. I'm going to say it again without my mask. Many of you know that I've been working very hard in the community to ensure that in the midst of the pandemic of COVID-19, that all of us are getting tested. Certainly, that is an area that we are facing and continue to face. Many of you know that we as African Americans, people of color, have been impacted in a more devastating manner than any other population. Now upwards of 110,000 who have died, over 1 million plus, close to 2 million cases in the United States, and the clear data that shows, information that shows that the large number of those who have died have been African Americans. We suffered the most when this government was not prepared with test kits, both in New York and places like New Orleans and Detroit. And we in Houston have tried to stand in the gap. And we opened, I did, with UMMC, the first testing site, no charge and no pre-registration. And we've continued to do so. And why? Because African Americans are unique. And that is the essence of the value and importance of the Freedmanstown Houston Conservancy. That is important. And I'll say it again so you'll know I know what I'm saying. The Houston Freedmanstown Conservancy. That is its importance. It's because it continues to tell our legacy. It gives us hope, but it tells us the truth. And that is what I will do in these few moments that I have with you, is to give you hope, but to tell you the truth. And to tell you the truth as it relates to our overall and continuing history, a history that should not be denied. Let me say something just for a moment. Over the course of these last couple of days, and as we have heard the rising voices of corporate America, the NFL, various entities that you thought you would have never heard. Someone sent me a text saying General Motors is putting aside $10 million to help in the question of race. Something that so many people have walked away from, not wanting to discuss. So many moments that we could have chosen to discuss it and maybe not be where we are today. Silence is not golden, and not remembering one's past is not a badge of honor. I've heard people say, let's start from where we are now. Let's not worry about the past. Well, I am grateful for the Houston Freedmanstown Conservancy because they understand that the future, today and yesterday, are equally important. And I become immersed in our history, and it helps me to be a better legislator, to convince my colleagues of the relevance and the importance of the work I do, whether it has to do with intelligence, meaning our intelligence in securing our nation, or issues like transportation security or the environment, or whether it has to do with the Commission to Study Reparations and Proposals, HR 40. Your colleagues have to know that you are well aware of your past and your history. You're solid in all of those. And what you bring to them is a knowledgeable base of information that they can depend on and support you in a variety of issues and initiatives that you engage in. So don't think knowing your past is not important. And we have a time now in our history that the past is so important. The 1800s, when Freedmanstown came into place, and our remembering of Logan's place and the incident of the soldiers who did nothing wrong, but were gunned down and engaged in battle because of the mistreatment that they received just because they ventured out. The details of that history is so very important. Freedmantown history is so very important. I remember as a young lawyer being engaged with the community to preserve the bricks and all of the assets. And we worked very hard. My first task in Congress was to work with leaders in Fourth Ward, Freedmanstown, to preserve and make their home even more, Allen Parkway Village, which is very much a part of Freedmanstown. We knew that the housing stock needed our involvement, and particularly since much of it was rental property. Now we know today we are challenged, but I am so grateful that the remnants of history can still be found there. we can still walk those streets. The bricks are still there. There are people with great legacies. Go to the homes and knock on the doors. They are willing and able to tell you the story, but at the same time, we must look to engage in economic empowerment in that community as well. And I am grateful to those citizens and residents who've remained there and been constant in their efforts to make a difference. Each and every one of you, I thank. And so I believe that the story of our history is not only combined with Freedman's Town, but it is combined throughout the nation. And Houston has to realize it has a grand and outstanding history, because from Freedman's Town, you can make your way over to the first park that was bought in the state of Texas. And interestingly enough, it was bought by 8 slaves, ex-slaves, for a mere number of dollars. And so it is important to take note of the fact that this is a rich combination when we think of Juneteenth. Juneteenth says to us that we paid our debt 2 years more than the rest of the slaves in this nation, that we were those who were never compensated, never received life insurance, workman's comp, never were allowed to stay united with our families, and saw our babies, as Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman? I've seen 13 children and gave birth to 13 children and seen most all sold into slavery." Let me say that again. Sojourner Truth, who was standing at the back of the room during one of the abolitionist meetings, and someone in the back, a gentleman by the fact in the front of the room, when he saw her hand or when she wanted to be recognized, said, "Yes, sir." And she wanted to be very clear. "Ain't I a woman," she said in her regal, tall, dark-skinned manner. "I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold into slavery." And so that is our story, that we in this region remained slaves for 2 extra years. How many children were born into slavery during that time? How many mothers lost their children? How many families were separated? So the burden of slavery is real, and it is important to be reminded of. But the joy in reminding us of slavery is for others who don't look like us to understand it, to learn about our history, to relish the fact that in this place, there are people who gave sacrifice, and relish that you understand it, not relish in excitement and applauding it, but relish the fact that you can understand it and give comfort to those people by saying, "I didn't know your history was like this. I want to know more. I respect you for your past. Don't ever forget your past. Don't ever stop talking about your children or talking to your children. And please talk to my children as well about this history." We helped build this nation. And in fact, the economic engine of America was cotton. Many people have heard the words cotton was king. And so as cotton was king, and not to have the overhead that I just mentioned of having to pay any salaries, provide any housing, any income, or any coverage of all the things that we expect somewhat today, then that means that the South, the landed part of this nation, could, without any burden, continue to build this engine, be landed, and send cotton to the North and export it. One of the greatest exports was cotton, as well as, if you look at the history of Europe, one of the greatest exports and imports were slaves, because they gave up when they went to Africa of dealing with gold and spices and found that slaves, the transatlantic slave trade, was the most prosperous for both Europe and the United States. Can you imagine the selling of people in the most brutal way, the dark passage where so many died? And that was the economic engine of Europe and the United States. They built the Wall Street banks. They built some of the very banks that we know today, some of the major college institutions, some of the Ivy League, some of the colleges in Washington, D.C. That is our history, raw as it is. I think many of you noticed that I'm standing in front of the 44th President of the United States. the Honorable Barack Hussein Obama, a dream that so many of us never thought would come to bear. But I hope that as I stand in front of this president, who just recently came to the forefront to give us healing words in the midst of this tumultuous crisis, that we realize how long it took to elect an African-American president and how long our journey was to get to this point, and how many lives were lost, how many stories have been told. So Houston, I can't afford for you to forget the history of Freedman's Town, the history of the Emancipation Park, the history of Independence Heights, and many of our other communities where African Americans settled. That is why I thought it was so very important to introduce legislation to name and build an Emancipation Trail. I wanted that legacy and that gift to be given not to me or even those who are here today, but to give that gift to those centuries beyond, and my children and their children and their children and their children and all of yours. I want it to be for those who are reaching those ages of which we know our time may be short. Give them a moment to reflect on the history when they walked as girls or boys on dirt streets along what was then Dowling Street, or walked in the streets of Freedman's Town, to know that we are honoring them by creating an Emancipation Trail from the point where Captain Granger pronounced the proclamation that indicated that we were free. Juneteenth, it is called. That proclamation freed the slaves west of the Mississippi, right in Galveston, and they began to make their way to many other parts of Texas and the nation. That Emancipation Trail was filled with tears of joy, and some loss, some burden. Some may have gotten sick and might not have made it to a place they wanted to go. But that is a place where we want to honor all of those who have had the heritage of slavery. And then we want to gift it to those who have not, for them to be able to understand the importance of our history, never to be forgotten, never to be forgotten. For President Barack Hussein Obama stands on the shoulders, in the sweat, and the tears, and the blood of those who went beyond and gave the ultimate sacrifice, slaves of yesteryear, that catapulted this son of an African to the presidency of the United States of America, an African and an American. And so I say to you today, as we look at Juneteenth, its symbolism has to be more for us. Because yes, I talked about the pandemic of COVID-19. I mentioned the importance of wearing a mask, stay socially distanced. I will say to you, make sure that you get tested. Understand that the symptoms are from the months before, cough and temperature, can't breathe. Now there are many other symptoms. We ask you to be assured to get tested and to check with your medical provider, because we're going to be in this for a period of time. But as I showed you the mask to be protected, I want you to know that the Emancipation Trail is protecting history. And when I spoke last year at Emancipation Park, honoring Juneteenth, I spoke about the legislation, how gratified I am that the Conservancy worked very hard with others of the Emancipation Park leadership and helped testify to support this legislation, from the Emancipation Park Conservancy to the Freedmen's Town, the Houston Freedmen's Town Conservancy, Eileen Lawal, Ramon Manning, the Kinders, the people of Emancipation, all of the elected officials, Representative Garnett Coleman, and of course the mayor, and many, many others were part of pushing and helping for the Emancipation Trail, as well as our friends in Galveston, the mayor, county judge, and my good friend Doug Matthews, who is an institution in Galveston. Can you imagine a year ago, I was talking about passing the legislation. And fortunately, along with my Senate partner, we were able to pass this legislation in the United States Congress, through the House and the Senate, Senator Cornyn, and ultimately passed and signed by the President of the United States. We have a law. Nothing can ever change that. Now we have to be the engines of making that law an active trail. And that is the funding that I'm now fighting for, to ensure that we get a study and a trail so that you can take your children along that history, that historic trail. That is the importance of it. It is entertainment by way of enjoyment, but it is our heart and soul. It is those who lost and never won, those who never saw a day of freedom. It is for us to be able to be reminded of the emotion of slavery embedded in our DNA and our soul. The reason I say all that, because I turn myself now to a moment to acknowledge that there is a pandemic of racism. This nation is sick. And so many times people have told people of color, African Americans, don't say that word. You use it all the time. When some of us will say something is racist. You know, racism is both a truth, but it is also someone's pain. And if someone feels that they've been rejected at a store or mistreated, and they can tell that it's because of their color of their skin, you can't tell them not to say that that action is not racist. That is their pain. And now we are suffering a pain that is unspeakable. And it has been seen around the nation, around the world. I spoke and have been called to speak on media around the world, from the BBC to Sky News. They are wondering and trying to struggle with what is happening in America. You see, they've always had this dream of this pearl of a nation, the perfection of America, this experiment of so many different people living together. For many years, Europe was monolithic, one race. Only of late, in the last couple of decades, have people moved around from other parts of the world, Asians and Africans coming from different parts of the world. But you know us? We started from the very beginning, even though it was a horrific and horrible act of slavery. We started with the indigenous people, Native Americans treated poorly, and then, of course, African Americans. And then as the years went on, immigrants coming from many different places. And we began to have these divisive attacks on immigrants coming from South and Central America, African Americans already under the glare of racism, and others coming from different parts who suffered discrimination. But we, African Americans, had the heaviest burden. It was a burden that fell upon us in the disparities in healthcare and education, in the environment of where we lived, in the ability to buy housing and redlining. It was a discrimination of the soldiers who came back from World War II, treated worse than the German prisoners, having to be in the back of the train, didn't have the ability to get the little bungalow that many other soldiers came back. My father was the youngest of 4 sons. 3 went off to World War I, and World War II, excuse me. This son was left with his widow mother so that she could be provided for, and he did provide for her. He was a master cartoonist working on Madison Avenue in New York. What a powerful and unbelievable opportunity for a young, good-looking Black man. But lo and behold, as those soldiers returned that did not look like me or my dad, he, in fact, was pushed out with all of that talent because he was Black and did not need to be there. It was good to be a substitute, but he was not there to be an equal with those individuals who had come back from World War II. That was the treatment of those who had likewise shed their blood, who were wounded and came back. That was the recognition of the Black soldiers and the Tuskegee Airmen, with which my father-in-law was. My father's artwork, as God would be, is now in the Smithsonian as one of the first African-American cartoonists. His name was Ezra Clyde Jackson. You see, we cannot allow ourselves to be denied, nor can we deny racism. It is here, it is real. And so I'm going to be charging the Houston Freedmen's Town Conservancy to be part of the discussion of race, not for a day, but for a continuing moment of time, to be able to recognize that we have a cancer, not of the body that can be cured by some of our major hospitals, but of this nation. It is promoted and provoked, unfortunately, by leadership around the nation. It saddens me that even a local radio host would take to the airwaves and speak about and denigrate African-American families. In discussing this issue of white privilege, this individual, during the midst of George Floyd's tragic and outright killing on the streets of Minneapolis, he began to say that, are you suggesting that we, meaning white people, should be embarrassed because we have a family? We have a dad that works overtime. We have a family that is together. Should we be embarrassed? Should we be embarrassed because we didn't allow our children to run the streets? Should we be embarrassed because we got an education, or we were scrappy and we pulled ourselves up? In sharp contrast, this not so subtle commentary was to suggest that we Black people brought all of these things on ourselves because we didn't have a united family. Our dad didn't work, or nor did he even work overtime. We didn't have a dad. We were allowed to run the streets. We were poorly educated. We were not scrappy. That is racism. That is defining people that you do not know. And that word should not be a sting for me to say it. It's a stain for it to be, but not a sting or a stain for me to say it. It really is what we have to grapple with. And for too long, we've not been able to utter the word. And if we have, we've been pushed back and rejected for being overly emotional or wrong, or saying a bad word, or creating havoc, or telling a audience of what we feel and creating divisiveness. No, I believe divisiveness is not telling the truth and not having us sit down and engage. I've always found that you understand and appreciate another human being for his or her humanity when you understand all of that person. And so I believe that we will have to, this nation, in order to be the shining city on the hill that the world watches and looks to, guides itself by what we do. That is why the protests around the world have a rippling effect. So goes America, so goes the world. They say we can do it, they can do it. But what America has to do is we have to be the problem solvers. We have to have solutions to what we are doing and what is happening. So I've talked to you about the success of the Emancipation Trail and why it's so very important and why you should be utilizing it once it is constructed, because by the way, along that trail are going to be historical markers, many cities that are historic along that line. But let me speak to what we've been grappling with. I've marched, protested, joined the Floyd family in the more than 60,000 Houstonians, protested earlier at another march, and then recently joined the Floyd family, but many of those in Minneapolis on this past Thursday at his Minneapolis homegoing service, where it was heard around the world that our plight has been because there's been a knee on our neck. Oh, there are individual stories to be told. We know that. We're not one monolithic group, but we are African Americans and descendants of slaves. Being descendants of slaves which were held around America or the Americas, including the Caribbean and South and Central America. So the descendants have been treated differently. And even though we have been scrappy and we've had families and we've had dads that have worked hard and moms that have worked hard and children that have made it, we still have huge and enormous disparities. No one can deny those disparities. We have the worst disparities in healthcare, the worst disparities, as I said, in education and income. I heard a number, and I don't want to be incorrect, but there are multiple numbers of African Americans that can meet the wealth of one family that is white in the overall average. So let us not fool ourselves, and let's not try to hide the truth, and let's not try to tell people to get over it. We have a problem. We have got to close those disparities. And those disparities wind up with our mistreatment in the criminal justice system. We're the largest population incarcerated in a nation that has incarcerated the most people in the world, and that is in our state and local and federal jails. We were the major sufferers of mandatory minimum. Our men, mostly, and in earlier years, were incarcerated for 25, 30, 40 years. Families were destroyed. I have families of children who are grown, who are crying because their father is still in prison. And so this is the basis upon which we find ourselves now. And the killing and the outright murder of George Floyd is evidence of the unequal treatment in the law. We are 13% of the population, and we are more than half of the killings by police, meaning Black men mostly, but some Black women. And that has got to stop. We elected the first African-American president, and the world stopped. The world cried, the world admired us. And we thought that we had turned that corner, that ever-changing corner, and that we had had a second rebirth of freedom. First being with the dreamer, Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his life so that we might be marching toward freedom and victory. But here we are again in the most visceral and visible murder that many of us ever in our life have seen. The kneeing of a Black man to the point of death on the streets of Minneapolis. The community crying out, he's dying, he's dying. And of course, George saying, I can't breathe, and calling for his mama. I think that we cannot ignore the truth. And so I introduced the Emancipation Trail in a happier moment. In the last couple of days, we introduced HR 7100, the George Floyd Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act, which provides for a complete overhaul of policing in this nation, moving from a warrior mentality that caused 2 police officers in Buffalo, New York, to push an elderly Caucasian male down to the ground where he began to immediately bleed, to a guardian mentality. This bill provides for a pathway for civilian review, for collection of data for misconduct of police. It insists on accreditation. It helps to establish standards dealing with excessive force, pedestrian stops, traffic stops, the duty to attend or duty to help. And it insists on diversified officers, but training, and have the ability to go home to their families, but also have the training to understand how to de-escalate. Because when you come upon someone who is mentally ill, the results should not be that he or she is shot dead in the street. That is the Pamela Turner story. That is the mishandling of Sandra Bland, a traffic stop that wound up ultimately with this beautiful young woman dying. And so we have got to recognize that yes, police are there to protect and serve, but they have to be engaged in an overhaul and training that will allow that to happen. We will be introducing more legislation this coming week. I'll be part of that. My legislation will be included. I support the legislation that will be put forward by the Congressional Black Caucus to acknowledge and to be able to go forward and move beyond the work that President Obama did with the 21st century policing, which could not seemingly move because there were people who didn't believe that it was needed or that it was an attack on law enforcement. On my record as a member of the United States Congress, and I slowly said that because I've had the privilege of sitting on the Judiciary Committee and overseeing all of our federal law enforcement. I want them to succeed and survive, but I also want to have Walter Scott. I would have wanted him to survive, or Abdou Diallo. I would have wanted him in a New York tenement to have survived, but he did not. Or to be able to see little Tamir Rice, 12 years old, or Michael Brown, or Eric Garner survive. They did not. And so I believe what we have an opportunity to do this Juneteenth, and I'm now saying that Juneteenth, is to not ignore race or racism, but to view ourselves as potential problem solvers. We can be healers. We can do so if we understand each other. I've seen over the last couple of days, as I said, and I think I said this earlier, many corporations rising up with huge contributions. The NFL, we thank Michael Jordan, $100 million, General Motors, Bank of America, $1 billion. What I would like those corporations to do is to listen to the community, listen to the Houston Freedmen's Town Conservancy, or the NAACP, or Shake Community Center, or the Urban League, or Black Lives Matter, or various faith organizations working in the community, toiling every single day, all the organization in Freedman Town, or maybe the mothers at public housing developments who could tell them what would help their children, or what about various public school districts throughout the nation or those in your area. Why not listen to African Americans to find out how you can best utilize those dollars? Why not give them a chance to express their pain and what will be helpful to them, rather than self-designing what you think is best for African Americans? Maybe someone will hear this. So here we are at a moment in time that we saw one of the most atrocious killings on the streets of the nation, unfortunately by individuals that were charged with protect and serve. Here we are, another year, celebrating, commemorating Juneteenth, and we're in the midst of a COVID-19 that we never thought we would experience. There's something about being prepared. We might face it again in the fall. But I still have hope, because I believe in the words of Sojourner Truth, and that is that ain't I a woman have borne 13 children into slavery and seen most all sold. Or in fact, Frederick Douglass, where there is no struggle, there is no power. Or the words of Barbara Jordan that said, when they ask me what I want or what you people want, I tell them I simply want America's promise. Or the words of Henry Cisneros that I said earlier today, that there's a dirty secret in America. Henry Cisneros, the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who worked with me in Allen Parkway Village, said there's a dirty secret in America, and that is racism. Or President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who said that everyone should want an equal chance and receive equal justice. Or Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that when you ask the question, why we can't wait, because the time is now. Now is the time. And so this is what I believe we are charged with in this year, 2020. And in the midst of the pandemic of racism, this country has to confront this divide and recognize that ill thought and hate speech, though allowed by the Constitution, should be disallowed by good people. And hopefully we can raise our voices together, collectively, yes, of African Americans who will say the words Black Lives Matter, that we'll have alongside of us as we've seen the wonderment of young people, so diverse, saying those words, but also loving their country. You are no less a patriot if you understand what has happened to a population of people. So on this Juneteenth, 2020, it is one unlike any other, but is a reflection and a story of slaves who were then made free, but still had the burden of struggling through a Reconstruction and Jim Crowism, and yes, a segregated America. And so many are still burdened with those disparities today. So it is important that we come together, we heal together, we fight together, but we fight to make the changes that in 2020 still need to be made. President Obama set a standard. We did a great job. We elected him. Get out and vote in 2020 to take your country to a place where you'd want it to be. Talk to your neighbor. He or she may be different. Reach out. Talk about what is going on in this country. Fight to pass real police accountability legislation and look at it as a helpmate and not a hinder. And then, of course, support the work of the Freedmen's Town Conservancy, and as well, the work that is being done in Emancipation Park and all over. Let's try and make a difference. Remember, this is our country. We are, in fact, patriots. We can do this. I just see a victory over the horizon. May I, for a moment, take this time to as well pay tribute as I close to Ovi Duncantel, who's gone on to glory, who's always fighting for freedom. Let me also pay tribute to the recent passing of Dr. Thomas Friedman, 100 years old, who was at Texas Southern University for 7 years, an orator, passionate civil rights leader in his own right, a pastor of a church. Let me thank him. And let me acknowledge the pastor emeritus of the Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, Reverend William A. Lawson, and the senior pastor of the Antioch Baptist Church, Reverend Dr. F.N. Williams. All of those are elders of our community. Let us acknowledge them, Pastor S.J. Gilbert and many others. Let us acknowledge all of those elders and those who've gone on. And let our commitment be that we will see victory, and we will not sing the song, "We shall overcome," but we will sing the song, "We have overcome." God bless all of you, and God bless the United States of America.